Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're plunging into something that, well, it touches every single one of our lives, often sparks really strong opinions, and let's face it, can feel incredibly messy and complex. We're talking about politics.
Yeah, for most people, when you hear that word politics, a lot of images probably flash through your mind,
Right.
right? Maybe it's election campaigns plastered everywhere, or those really passionate protests you see in the streets.
Or maybe it's just the constant back and forth from figures on the news, people that either really resonate with you or maybe sometimes just make you sigh in frustration.
Absolutely. For a lot of us, it brings up associations that aren't exactly, let's say, positive. It often gets dismissed as, a dirty game.
Or even the last resort of scoundrels, as someone famously put it. And there's that really biting, sarcastic line from Ernest Benn that pops up sometimes. How did it go? Politics is the art of looking for trouble.
Finding it, whether it exists or not, diagnosing it wrongly, and applying the wrong remedy. Yeah, I know the one. It's cynical, but it captures how some people feel.
And that's totally understandable because those are the common sort of everyday impressions many of us have. We tend to see politics mainly through the lens of conflict, strategy, maybe the personality is involved.
But here's where things get really interesting with the sources you've shared with us for this deep dive. They challenge those surface level impressions. They kind of invite us to step back from the campaigns, step back from the day-to-day news cycle, and look at politics from a much more systematic, fundamental perspective.
Exactly. So, our mission today is to cut through those often vague assumptions, maybe some of the negativity too, and explore what politics fundamentally is. Not just as, a collection of institutions or events, but as a core human social activity.
And then from there, we want to dig into several major schools of thought. These are really different theoretical lenses that offer wildly contrasting answers to some fundamental questions. Questions about conflict, cooperation, how society should be organized.
Right. We're going to unpack some foundational ideas from political theory, drawing straight from the material you've given us. It's really about giving you, the listener, a clearer, more analytical picture of what politics is at its root.
And how these different major perspectives,
Yeah.
liberal, Marxist, communitarian, define its very nature and purpose. Think of it as moving beyond just the who's winning headline.
What is actually happening here, fundamentally? What's
Yeah.
the underlying process?
Exactly. So join us as we journey from, well, the ancient origins of the word itself,
Mm-hmm.
then move through its modern understanding as this dynamic social process that happens pretty much everywhere.
And finally, explore how these major theoretical perspectives see the core nature and purpose of politics. Ready to dive in?
Let's do it.
Okay, so where do we start? The word itself, politics. Where does it come from?
Yeah, let's start there. We have to go way back, all the way back to ancient Greece. The word comes from polis.
Ah, the polis, the city-state. I remember that from history class. It was like the heart of ancient Greek life, wasn't it?
It really was. In that context, the polis wasn't just a place on a map. It was the absolute central unit of social life, cultural life, and, crucially for us, political life.
So politics originally was tied directly to what citizens did inside the city-state.
Precisely. It was fundamentally associated with the activities of citizens within that polis.
Mm.
It was all about their role as active members, as operators, you might say, of the state itself.
Okay, so this gives us that traditional kind of classical view. Politics equals the state and the stuff that happens inside it.
That's the core of it. When someone like Aristotle titled his major work Politics, he wasn't really talking about global trade deals or, social media's influence. He was talking about the affairs of the city-state.
How it was organized, what the citizens did.
Exactly. How life within the polity should be structured. And this traditional view really saw political science, the study of politics, as essentially the science of the state.
Wow.
The focus was squarely on studying state institutions, their structures, maybe even thinking about what a perfect state might look like, which is a lot of what Aristotle was doing.
And you said we can still see traces of that old connection today, like in how universities name things.
Absolutely. Our sources point out that this historical link still kind of lingers. You'll find university departments named civics and politics right next door to others called political science.
Ah, okay. So different names, but hinting at that same core idea.
Right. And you see it in institute names, too, like the Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics versus the London School of Economics and Political Science. They use the term slightly differently, but it highlights that dual meaning is still around politics, referring both to the actual activity and the systematic study of that activity.
Okay, so the word definitely carries this historical weight tied to the state. But the sources you shared, they really emphasize a shift, right, towards a more modern understanding. Politics isn't just cooped up in government buildings anymore.
Not at all. That's a key insight from modern writers. They increasingly recognize that if you only look at formal state institutions, you're missing a huge chunk of the picture. Politics doesn't just happen in the state. The sources say it permeates the entire social fabric.
So it's more like a force, or maybe a process that's happening within society across all sorts of different areas.
That's a great way to put it. Instead of seeing politics as just the sum total of government offices and laws, the modern view really emphasizes it as a social process. It's dynamic, it's interactive, it's ongoing.
And you find it operating throughout society, right?
Yeah.
In lots of different settings, not just Parliament or the White House.
Exactly. It could be happening in a community meeting, in negotiations between interest groups, even within families sometimes, though we need to qualify that a bit later.
Okay, so if it's this broad social process, where does it kick off? What's the trigger for this process to start happening?
According to the sources we looked at, this process really gets going whenever there's what's called a political situation.
Yeah.
And at the absolute core of that situation, writers like Alan Ball, Stephen Wasby, J.D.B. Miller all seem to agree on this is conflict, disagreement, and the efforts to deal with or resolve that conflict.
Wow. So disagreement isn't just like part of politics. It's absolutely essential for politics to even exist in this view.
Necessarily so. It's
Yeah.
fundamental. Stephen Rosby is quoted saying something like, where there is politics, there is controversy. Where there are issues, there is politics.
No controversy, no politics.
Pretty much. If there's no controversy, if there's no debate over issues, then politics, in this analytical sense, simply doesn't arise. I mean, think about it. If everyone agreed on everything all the time,
You wouldn't need a process to sort things out.
exactly, you wouldn't need politics. So that disagreement, that controversy, is the starting point.
That really highlights the fundamental connection there.
It does. And J.D.B. Miller adds another important layer. He links this disagreement specifically to the use of government.
Okay, how so?
Well, Miller suggests that political activity doesn't just start with disagreement. It's then concerned with using government or maybe some form of organized public authority to resolve that conflict.
So it's not just any disagreement, but one where people look to government or public authority to step in.
Right. Whether the goal is to push for change or maybe to prevent change from happening, Miller's view is that it requires both that initial disagreement and the presence of government as a means, as a tool, to push for or resist a particular outcome related to that disagreement.
So conflict plus some kind of engagement with government or public authority to navigate it.
That really captures Miller's point well. But then the sources introduce a bit of a critique or maybe a refinement by looking at a common example used to illustrate this. It's Alan Ball's example.
The nursery example, 2 kids, 1 toy.
That's the one. Ball suggests this is a political situation because, the kids could fight over the toy that's violence, or maybe their mother steps in and decides who gets it. That's authority.
Okay, I can sort of see the logic there. You've got a dispute, and you've got an external power, the mother, intervening. But the source says this example has some problems.
It does. 2 really significant ones, actually. And they're crucial for understanding politics as a public thing, not just any old squabble.
Okay, what's the first flaw?
The first defect, as the source puts it, is that Ball presents this as a fundamentally private conflict. It's just between 2 children over a toy. Our sources are really clear. A political situation, properly speaking, arises at a public level.
So it has to involve more than just a couple of individuals sorting out their own personal issue. It needs a bigger stage.
Exactly. It needs to involve 2 or more major groups within a broader social setting. Think local, regional, national, even international. And these conflicts can play out along different lines, economic lines, cultural, linguistic, religious, ethnic.
So the scale and the scope matter. It has to be about public issues.
Yes, issues that affect broad categories of people, not just the individuals immediately involved. And critically, they demand a solution that applies publicly, a kind of universal solution within that context, not just a private deal between 2 people.
Okay, so the classic example. A disagreement between, say, a husband and wife about where to go on vacation that's private and not political in this sense.
Right.
But the broader public question of gender equality, women's rights, men's roles in society, that absolutely is political because it affects large groups and demands public-level answers.
Precisely. Or think about conflicts within a specific organization, like a company or maybe a church. According to the source, those only really enter the political sphere in this public sense if they spill over. if they start to affect public life more broadly, or if they demand a solution at the public level that impacts the wider society.
Okay, makes sense. Public scope, major groups, universal solution. What was the second defect in the kids and toy example?
The second issue is that Ball includes violence or war, the kids fighting, as one possible method of resolution. Our sources state really emphatically that resort to violence or war does not qualify as a political solution.
Whoa, okay, hang on. That feels like a really important distinction. War isn't politics, but
Yeah.
they seem so intertwined, in history and even today.
It's a strong claim, isn't it? But the argument in the source is that war, or violence more generally, is actually a symptom of the failure of politics, is what happens when the political process breaks down.
So what does count as a political solution then in this view?
A truly political solution is one that comes about through processes like negotiation, persuasion, maybe arbitration, compromise, applying pressure, counting votes, essentially tactics short of war or overt violence.
Okay, so it's defined by the process used, negotiation, voting, etc., not just the outcome.
Exactly. And the outcome, ideally, is supposed to be acceptable, or at least accepted, by the parties involved, precisely because it was arrived at through these nonviolent, structured, legitimate means, rather than just being imposed by force.
That's a critical point. The legitimacy of the process matters.
It does. And this whole idea leads us very nicely into another really influential definition that helps explain how these negotiated or debated solutions actually become binding on everyone involved.
This must be David Easton's definition. Politics is concerned with the authoritative allocation of values for a society. It definitely sounds a bit academic at first glance. Let's really unpack those terms.
Absolutely. It's concise, maybe a bit dense, but incredibly powerful once you break it down. We need to look closely at those three key terms: values, allocation, and especially authoritative.
Okay, let's start with values. What are we talking about here? Not just like moral values.
No, much broader than that. According to Easton, values here simply means things considered valuable, whether they be spiritual or material. Basically, these are the things that people in a society want or need or consider desirable.
So it could be abstract things like rights, freedom, security, justice.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
But also very material things like wealth, resources, access to healthcare, education opportunities.
The source later lists some specific examples political scientists study, right? Like power, wealth, well-being, health, skill, even things like affection or respect.
Exactly. Power, enlightenment, which is like knowledge or education. Wealth, well-being, covering health and security. Skill, affection, rectitude, which is about morality or justice, and deference, meaning respect or status. These are the desirable things societies grapple over.
Okay, so values are the desirable things. What about allocation? That sounds like distribution.
That's exactly what it is. Allocation is the distribution of these valuable things among the various individuals or groups within society. How do these desirable things get parceled out?
And this distribution happens mainly through policy.
Primarily, yes. The source describes policy as a web of decisions, and a decision is simply a selection among alternatives.
Choosing one path over others.
Right, so policy involves both arriving at that selection, deciding how these values, these desirable things will be distributed, and then also putting that decision into practice, implementing it. It's the mechanism by which desirable things are actually apportioned in society.
Okay, so values are what people want. Allocation is how they get distributed through policy. The third term, authoritative, feels like the real kicker here. This is what makes the allocation political, right?
It absolutely is. This is the crucial element, the secret sauce, if you like.
Yeah.
What makes a policy or an allocation political is that it's authoritative. And an allocation is authoritative when the people who are affected by it feel that they must or ought to obey it.
Ah, okay. So it's not just that a decision is made, but that people accept it as binding. It has legitimacy.
Exactly. It's about legitimacy, or at least the acceptance of an obligation to comply. It's not necessarily about brute force, although the capacity for coercion might be lurking in the background. Easton emphasizes that authority, in this sense, denotes the capacity to secure more or less willing compliance from people for a decision or action.
Willing compliance, that's key. People accept they have to follow it.
They accept its binding nature. Maybe they agree with it morally. Maybe it's just tradition. Maybe they fear the consequences of not complying. That we'll get into those grounds later. But the point is, they recognize the decision as having authority over them.
So if I'm hearing this right, the big takeaway from Easton is that politics isn't just about who gets to decide about desirable things, but why we, as members of society, feel we have to follow those decisions. It's about that sense of obligation.
That's it. Precisely. It's the binding nature of the decision, the societal acceptance for whatever reason of its authority that makes an allocation political. And this definition really helps explain why politics, seen this way, is a universal social phenomenon.
Universal how so?
Because every human society, no matter how simple or complex its structure, has to have some mechanisms for authoritatively resolving differences about what goals to pursue, or as Easton puts it quite starkly, deciding who is to get what there is of desirable things.
Someone has to make the call, and people have to generally accept it for society to function.
Exactly. An authoritative allocation of values is simply unavoidable if a group of people is going to live together in any kind of organized way. You can't have everyone doing their own thing with shared resources or goals forever.
So Easton takes that idea of politics as conflict resolution that we talked about earlier,
Right.
and adds that absolutely critical layer of authoritativeness. It's not just resolving conflict, but resolving it in a way that sticks, a way that's accepted as binding.
Perfectly put. And other thinkers build on this. Jeffrey K. Roberts, for instance, defines politics as both the activity and the study of it. As an activity, he sees it as the process within a social system, where the goals for that whole system get selected, prioritized.
Prioritize in terms of time, like what do we do first, and also resources, right? Where does the money or effort go?
Exactly. Selected, prioritized, and then implemented. That's the process for Roberts.
And Roberts seems to explicitly bring in both cooperation and conflict resolution in his definition. He mentions using political authority and maybe even coercion if needed.
Yes, he takes what the source identifies as a broadly liberal perspective on this. He sees politics involving both sides of that coin, cooperation and conflict, managed through political authority, with coercion sort of held in reserve as a last resort.
And he also reiterates that point about the scope that politics usually involves various kinds of groups, including political parties.
Right. And he really underscores that distinguishing characteristic we've touched on a couple of times now. Politics is concerned exclusively with the public goals of society and the public allocation of resources to achieve those goals.
He draws that contrast with economics again.
He does. Economics, for instance, can deal with public allocation, like government spending, or private allocation, like how a company uses its money. But politics, for Roberts and in this general framework, is strictly focused on the public sphere, public goals, public resources, and the authoritative distribution of values within that public realm for public ends.
Okay, this is really starting to build a clear picture. We've grounded the term in its history, looked at politics as this process of conflict resolution using government, and then layered on Easton's crucial concept of the authoritative allocation of values, particularly in the public sphere and involving groups. The sources then kind of distill all this down into 5 general characteristics of politics as a social process. Let's walk through those core features.
Yeah, based on everything we've just discussed, what are the essential features, the things that our sources say every political process shares? Well, the first one, and maybe the most fundamental, comes right back to where we started. Politics involves conflict or dispute regarding allocation of values.
Right. Conflict isn't just incidental, it's the engine that starts the whole process.
Absolutely. A political situation, in this view, necessarily kicks off with some kind of conflict or dispute, and it's specifically over the allocation of resources or values that are both rare and valuable.
And the source explained why that combination creates conflict, didn't it? Because if something is valuable but super abundant,
No fight. Everyone can have it.
or if it's rare but nobody really wants it,
Again, no conflict.
the conflict happens when something is valuable, rare, and desired by many people or groups at the same time.
Exactly. That convergent scarcity plus widespread desire is what generates the political situation. It creates that clash of interests, those competing claims for the limited desirable things, whatever they may be.
Like the examples mentioned earlier. Power, wealth, well-being, or maybe more concrete things like who gets access to good schools or hospitals or public parks or business opportunities.
Precisely. It's the tension created by those conflicting claims over scarce, desirable values that gets the political process rolling.
Okay, fundamental starting point. Conflict over scarce values. Second key feature. Politics is concerned with public goals and decisions.
This really reinforces that distinction we made when we were looking at the flaws in Bowles' nursery example. Remember, not all conflicts over how resources get allocated are political. Politics, in this specific analytical sense, is focused exclusively on conflicts that involve public goals and public issues that require public decisions.
So back to the example. A disagreement between two neighbors about where their property line is, that's probably private, not political.
Right. Likely a civil dispute.
Unless maybe it somehow brings up broader issues about zoning laws that affect the whole community or becomes a public nuisance involving many people. Then it might cross the line into the public sphere.
That's the idea. The source elaborates with similar examples. A dispute between just one worker and their employer might be a private labor issue. But when it becomes a question about, say, minimum wage laws or workplace safety regulations that affect all workers in an industry or even across the economy.
Then it's a public issue. It concerns broad categories of people.
Exactly. And it demands a solution at the public level, like legislation or regulation. The same goes for the husband-wife domestic dispute versus the public question of gender claims and rights. One's private, the other is political because it's public in scope and implication.
And there was that quote from Michael Curtis that really seemed to nail this point.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah.
Curtis says the student of politics is normally concerned with inquiry into matters of public concern, with the behavior and acts that may concern a society as a totality.
Or which may ultimately be resolved by the exercise of legitimate coercion. That captures both the wide societal scope and the fact that the state's power might ultimately be involved in resolving these public issues.
Precisely. So public scope is the second key feature. Third feature, politics requires authoritative decisions.
Okay, this brings us right back to Easton's crucial point, doesn't it? For the whole process of political conflict resolution to actually mean something, the outcome, the decision that's reached has to be binding on everyone it affects.
It has to stick, otherwise it's just talk.
And that binding nature, that authoritativeness, comes from different grounds, as Easton pointed out. People accept it for different reasons.
Yes, the source reiterates those grounds. Maybe people accept it because they believe it's morally right, legitimacy from morality, or because it's always been done that way, legitimacy from tradition or custom, or maybe simply because they fear the consequences of disobedience, compliance due to power or fear. Fundamentally, authority in politics involves either legitimacy, the sense that the decision is right and ought to be obeyed, or power, the capacity to enforce compliance, or very often some combination of both.
The examples the source uses here are really helpful in showing how this works on the ground, like reserving bus seats for ladies, or maybe affirmative action policies reserving posts or university seats for scheduled castes or tribes.
Right. The source suggests these are often accepted as authoritative, largely because of legitimacy, a widespread belief, perhaps, that weaker or historically disadvantaged sections of society need special protection or opportunities to ensure fairness.
So acceptance based on a shared understanding of justice or necessity?
Exactly. Then you have the other example, taxes. This highlights the power, or maybe legitimacy backed by power aspect. The source points out the rich might pay higher income or wealth taxes that fund public services largely used by the poor. They can't just refuse to pay. It's an authoritative allocation backed by the force of law.
And conversely, the poor pay sales tax on basic commodities. And that money contributes to things like police or national defense, which might disproportionately protect the property and interests of the rich. But again, they can't refuse. It's authoritative.
It perfectly illustrates how authoritative decisions ensure compliance for public goals, often requiring contributions or sacrifices from different groups, regardless of their direct individual benefit or even their personal agreement with the policy.
And the source is clear that this authority isn't just an abstract idea, it's backed by real-world machinery.
Definitely. You've got laws, executive orders, established customs, public opinion, providing the framework on one hand. And then you have the more coercive instruments like the police, courts, magistrates, prisons backing it up if needed.
But it also makes that important point that these authoritative allocations aren't set in stone forever, right? They hold sway until a new arrangement is established and accepted as authoritative.
Which is crucial. Political decisions can be changed through the political process itself. But while they are in effect, while they hold authority, they are binding. That's key to the ongoing dynamic nature of politics.
Okay, so we've got conflict over scarce values, focus on public issues, requirement for authoritative decisions. Fourth feature, politics involves interest groups. So who are the main players in this drama? Who's generating these conflicts and demanding these allocations?
Well, the source points out that the clash of interests that really drives a political situation typically originates from different large groups within society.
Not just random individuals acting alone, but collectives. People acting together based on shared interests.
Generally, yes. For these interests to become politically relevant, the groups holding them usually need to be somewhat conscious of their shared interests. They need to recognize they have something in common that's at stake. And they also need to be more or less organized to effectively pursue those interests in the public arena.
So groups that are aware and mobilized.
Exactly. The conflicting claims and the demands for specific authoritative allocations largely come from these interest groups. Think of labor unions fighting for workers' rights versus employers' organizations arguing for deregulation, or environmental groups pushing for conservation policies versus industry groups concerned about economic impact, or groups based on identity, like ethnic or religious groups, advocating for their specific needs or rights.
And political parties fit into this picture as a special kind of group.
According to the source, yes. Political parties emerge in this environment, partly to aggregate and articulate these diverse group interests. They formulate broader policy proposals and platforms that aim to incorporate the interests of the various groups that support them, usually framed within their particular ideology. They act as key intermediaries, translating group demands into potential public policy.
Okay, that makes sense. Groups are the key actors, pushing and pulling. Fifth and final general characteristic. Politics is an instrument of conflict resolution. This sounds like the intended endpoint, the goal of the whole process.
It is often presented that way, yes. The political process supposedly takes that initial conflict over values and allocation and works towards finding some kind of resolution, some way to manage the disagreement.
This is where the source signals that major divergence in views we talked about earlier, isn't it? There's no universal agreement on whether politics actually resolves conflict or how.
Exactly. This is a crucial point of departure between the major theoretical perspectives. While the liberal view, which we'll get into, generally sees politics as an instrument that reconciles conflicting interests, aiming for a widely accepted outcome.
The Marxist view fundamentally disagrees.
Fundamentally, it argues that the core interests in a society divided by class are actually irreconcilable. From that perspective, politics isn't really a tool of reconciliation at all. It's a tool of domination used by the ruling class to maintain its power and suppress the conflict.
Wow. So one view sees politics aiming for resolution, the other sees it as perpetuating conflict or domination.
A stark difference. And in the Marxist view, genuine conflict resolution only happens when the underlying class structure is overthrown, leading to a classless society. At that point, they argue politics itself would cease to exist because its very function managing class conflict would be gone.
That is a profound disagreement about the very purpose and capability of politics. Reconciliation versus maintaining domination until the system changes entirely.
It really is. And just before we dive fully into those different views, the source briefly circles back to that idea of politicization.
Right, the extent to which people are actually involved in this whole political process.
Yeah, it's about drawing individuals or groups into political activity, giving them a role, however small or large, in making these public authoritative decisions. The level of politicization in a society tells you something important about the nature of its political system.
And the source contrasts different levels using historical or system examples.
It does. Think about an absolute monarchy, or maybe a military dictatorship. Decision-making power is concentrated in the hands of a very small group, the monarch and their advisors, or the military junta. Politicization is very low for the general population.
Most people are just subjects, not active participants.
Exactly. Contrast that with, say, the ancient Greek city-states. For the citizens, the free men politicization was quite high. They were expected to participate actively. But crucially, it was still limited because it excluded large segments of the population, like slaves and foreigners.
Okay. And modern democracy.
Modern democracy, at least in theory, intends to achieve universal politicization, drawing all adult citizens into the process through voting, participation, freedom of speech, etc. It represents the highest potential level of politicization. Although the source notes, even in democracies, situations like emergencies can sometimes lead to power becoming more concentrated, restricting broad participation, at least temporarily.
So understanding the level of politicization helps us grasp who actually gets to play a role in this process of making authoritative allocations.
Precisely. It adds another dimension to our understanding. So, having laid all this groundwork establishing the core nature of politics as this social process rooted in conflict over scarce values, focused on public issues, requiring authoritative allocation usually involving groups, and aiming or perhaps failing to resolve that conflict, we can now really appreciate how different fundamental perspectives interpret this whole phenomenon.
Right. Because how you answer those core questions like, what's the real source of all this conflict, or can it ever truly be resolved in a fair way, leads you down very different paths in understanding what politics is and what its ultimate purpose, or maybe even its ultimate fate, might be. Let's dive into those three main views the sources highlight.
Okay, the big three presented here are the liberal view, the Marxist view, and the communitarian view. They each offer a distinct lens, a different interpretation of the nature of political conflict, and the potential outcomes of the whole political process.
Let's start with the liberal view. The source traces this back to thinkers like John Locke and the broader tradition of liberalism that emphasizes individual rights and freedoms.
That's right. And this perspective typically begins with called a pluralistic understanding of society. It doesn't see society as one unified whole or just split into two warring camps. Instead, it sees society as made up of numerous individuals who pursue their various interests primarily as members of different organized groups.
So society is viewed as this complex landscape, a mosaic almost, of various interest groups interacting, competing, sometimes cooperating.
Exactly. You've got labor unions, business associations, environmental groups, religious organizations, community associations, professional bodies, all sorts of groups. These groups are generally aware of their specific interests, and they actively engage in the political process, lobbying, campaigning, advocating, trying to secure those these policies and decisions that favor their particular interests.
Which makes politics fundamentally a group activity in this view. It's driven by the interaction of these groups.
Largely, yes. It's the interplay between these groups that generates much of the political dynamic. But at the same time, since it's ultimately the state that usually have the recognized authority to make those binding authoritative allocations.
Politics is also seen as a state activity.
Right, it's both. The state is seen as the arena where these groups compete and cooperate.
Yeah.
And it's also the entity that receives demands and supports, like tax revenue, obedience to laws, votes, from these various groups. And in response, it delivers policies and decisions. So the liberal view sees politics happening both through the interaction of groups and within the formal structures of the state.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, how does this liberal view interpret the conflict that we establish as so fundamental to politics? Is it seen as destructive or?
This is a really core tenet of the liberal perspective. It holds that while, yes, different groups definitely have conflicting interests, that's undeniable, there's also believed to be a deeper underlying common interest that ultimately connects everyone in society.
A common ground, despite the disagreement.
Exactly. And because of this belief in an underlying common interest, politics is seen, fundamentally, as an instrument of conflict resolution. Its primary purpose is to manage and reconcile these competing interests.
So the idea is that even though groups clash, the conflict isn't necessarily, fatal. It's not insurmountable. A way can always be found to reconcile the different interests.
Generally, yes. The belief is that the conflict, while real, is not very deep or inherently irreconcilable. There's always assumed to be some commonality, some shared ground that allows for reconciliation. The source uses examples like finding ways to resolve disputes between employers and workers, or between producers and consumers, or establishing traffic rules that benefit everyone, even if they restrict individual freedom slightly.
So politics provides the mechanism for finding those solutions.
Yes, politics, in this perspective, allows society's organized power, typically the state, to step in and facilitate solutions through processes like negotiation, bargaining, and compromise. And the aim is to find solutions that are considered legitimate and just. Conflict is seen as something capable of being resolved through conciliation, compromise, and, if absolutely necessary, the use of legitimate coercion by the state, ultimately leading towards order and justice.
Okay, and this naturally connects to the idea that politics promotes the common good, right? If it reconciles interests based on a common interest.
Precisely, because politics, in the liberal view, is believed to aim at discovering and pursuing this underlying common interest. It's therefore seen as a means of promoting the common good for society as a whole.
But the liberal idea of the common good isn't necessarily some single, fixed, predefined ideal that everyone must conform to, is it? It's more emergent.
That's a good way to put it. It's generally defined more processually. The common good is often seen as the outcome that successfully accommodates the interests of all the relevant parties involved in a particular conflict or decision. The political process itself, the negotiation, the debate, the compromise among different groups is seen as the instrument through which this common good is discovered and achieved. It's seen as an instrument of progress.
Progress? How so?
Well, the idea is that as these conflicting interests interact and are debated in the public sphere, an awareness of the larger common interest gradually emerges. The contending groups, through the push and pull of the political process, eventually become willing to accept solutions that are conducive to this broader common good, solutions they might not have initially preferred.
So it's not just about settling for the lowest common denominator or a messy compromise where nobody is really happy.
Ideally, no. The source emphasizes that it's not just that compromise is possible, but that politics, working well, can lead to evolving policies that actually simultaneously improve conditions for different groups. Think about finding solutions where workers get better wages and conditions, and companies achieve higher productivity and profits.
Or finding ways to ensure reasonable prices for consumers that still allow producers to thrive and innovate. Those win-win scenarios, or at least positive sum scenarios.
Exactly. Those kinds of outcomes that improve the overall situation. This focus on finding solutions that benefit society broadly, improve well-being, and manage the complexities of a modern economy is linked in the source directly to the development and justification of the modern welfare state.
Okay, so pulling that all together. In the liberal view, politics is this dynamic interaction of diverse groups, operating within and engaging with the state. It uses legitimate processes like negotiation and compromise to manage and resolve conflicts based on a belief in an underlying common interest. And its ultimate aim is to achieve outcomes that accommodate diverse interests, promote the common good, and contribute to societal progress.
That captures the essence of the liberal perspective as laid out in the source really well. Now, shall we pivot to a view that offers a dramatically different picture? The Marxist view.
Right. This perspective, obviously rooted in the work of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, seems to start from a completely different foundation, really focusing on economics above all else.
It absolutely does. A fundamental starting point, the core premise of Marxism, is the primacy of economic interests. Everything else flows from that. Political institutions, political activities, laws, ideologies. According to this view, these are not independent forces acting on their own. They are fundamentally seen as an outgrowth, a superstructure, built upon the underlying economic base of society.
The economic base meaning, like how things are produced, who owns the factories, the land.
Precisely. The mode of production, for example, feudalism, capitalism, and the relations of production. Who owns the means of production, who works for whom. Marxism argues that these economic relations ultimately shape and determine all other social relations, including political ones.
So economic factors are seen as the fundamental engine driving history, driving society, and therefore driving politics.
That's the core argument. For Marxists, it's conflicting economic interests that are the ultimate fundamental motive force behind all politics. This is a key difference from liberalism. While liberalism sees a whole variety of issues that can become political, economic, yes, but also cultural, linguistic, religious, identity-based, and so on.
Marxism says, hold on, the real conflict, the one that truly matters underneath it all, is the economic one.
Exactly. Marxism argues that the clash of economic interests, specifically the conflict between different economic classes, is the fundamental issue. Other conflicts over language, religion, whatever, are considered secondary or superficial. Resolving those secondary issues doesn't get rid of the root conflict. Conversely, they argue, if you could resolve the fundamental economic conflict, the other conflicts would likely dissolve or become much easier to manage. Evading the core economic issue just makes other settlements ultimately futile or temporary.
Okay, and where does this core economic conflict come from in their analysis?
It stems from what Marxists see as an inherently irrational and exploitative system of production under capitalism. In this system, a small minority of people, the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, owns the major means of production, the factories, the land, the capital, while the vast majority of the proletariat, the workers, owns little but their ability to work, forcing them to sell their labor to the owners simply to survive.
So the existence of private property in the means of production is the key.
It's the absolute key. This private ownership, they argue, fundamentally divides society into two main antagonistic classes: the haves, the owners, the exploiters, and the have-nots, the workers, the exploited, masters and servants in the earlier forms. And crucially, their core economic interests are seen as inherently, structurally irreconcilable.
Irreconcilable, meaning there's no genuine common interest between the owner class and the working class. Their interests are fundamentally opposed.
That's the Marxist position. The profit of the capitalist comes from extracting surplus value from the labor of the worker. Their interests are diametrically opposed in this core economic relationship. There's no underlying common interest that can truly bridge that gap within the capitalist system itself.
And how do politics and the state fit into this picture of irreconcilable class conflict?
They are seen as a direct product of this class division and the resulting antagonism. The state and the political system, in the Marxist view, didn't just appear out of nowhere. They arose historically as a result of society splitting into classes with conflicting interests. And importantly, they continue to function primarily to serve the interests of the dominant economic class.
So the state isn't a neutral umpire like the liberal view might suggest. It takes sides.
Absolutely takes sides. Engels famously argued this point. He said the state arises, seemingly, to moderate the conflict between classes, to keep it within the bounds of order. But because it arises from the conflict, it inevitably becomes the state of the economically dominant class. This class, by controlling the economy, then uses the state and its political power to cement its position, becoming the politically dominant class as well. And this gives it new tools, new means, to hold down and exploit the oppressed class.
And Engels used historical examples to back this up. Slave owners, feudal lords.
Yes, the source mentions his examples. The ancient state was, fundamentally, the state of the slave owners for holding down the slaves. The feudal state was the organ of the nobility for holding down the peasant serfs. And the modern representative state, despite its democratic appearances, is seen by Marxists as an instrument for capital's exploitation of wage labor. In each case, the state and political power serve the interests of the ruling economic class.
So this paints a picture where politics is essentially a tool used by the dominant class to maintain its position and suppress the subordinate class.
That's the core Marxist interpretation of politics in a class-divided society.
Okay, so if the core class interests are fundamentally irreconcilable, what does that mean for conflict resolution? Liberalism sees politics as conflict resolution.
Marxism says, not so fast. Because the conflict is structural and irreconcilable, class conflict is seen as inherent, unavoidable, as long as society remains divided into classes. And all politics, in the Marxist view, ultimately stems from and reflects this ongoing class struggle. Remember that famous line from the Communist Manifesto?
The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles.
Exactly. A struggle that, they argued, inevitably leads either to a revolutionary reconstitution of society or the common ruin of the contending classes.
So what's the critical implication here for our understanding of politics as a process, if the conflict is irreconcilable?
The critical implication is that this fundamental class conflict cannot be resolved by politics. Politics, in fact, is seen as part of the problem, part of the system of domination. It's used by the dominant class not to genuinely reconcile interests, but to manage and suppress the conflict, to maintain social control and the existing power structure.
So what might look like a compromise achieved through political negotiation
Is seen from the Marxist perspective as fundamentally an illusion, or, perhaps more accurately, a compromise imposed by the dominant class on the dependent class, reflecting the existing unequal power relations, not a genuine meeting of equals finding common ground. It might temporarily smooth things over, but it doesn't resolve the underlying antagonism.
So politics is essentially about maintaining the status quo of domination and suppressing dissent as long as classes exist.
Yes, that's the view.
Yes.
As long as society is divided into exploiting and exploited classes, the state and the political process function primarily as tools of the dominant class for suppression. The source even notes that this logic extends, in Marxist theory, even after a hypothetical socialist revolution.
How so?
Well, during the transitional phase, the dictatorship of the proletariats, the state is still seen as necessary. But now it's wielded by the formerly oppressed working class to suppress the overthrown capitalist class, to prevent counter-revolution, and to guide society towards the final goal, communism, a fully classless society. The state is still an instrument of class power, just wielded by a different class for a different purpose.
Okay, but what happens in that final stage? Communism, the truly classless society. If class conflict is the engine of politics,
Then with the complete elimination of classes, the fundamental source of conflict, according to Marxism, disappears. And if there's no more class conflict to manage or suppress, then the state, as an instrument of class domination, is no longer needed. Politics, as it was understood, the struggle for power between classes, the administration of society based on class rule, also becomes unnecessary. The state, in Engels' famous phrase, withers away.
the end of class conflict literally means the end of politics itself.
In the Marxist conception, yes. Because politics is defined by that class struggle and the need for a dominant class to maintain control through the state. Interests, in this view, cannot be truly reconciled by politics within a class system. The conflict itself must be ended by fundamentally transforming the underlying economic conditions which they believed required revolution.
Wow. That is an incredibly radical and transformative vision. It completely inverts the liberal premise of politics as this ongoing, potentially positive process of reconciliation and progress.
It's a stark contrast, absolutely. Shall we move to the third perspective? The communitarian view offers yet another angle, critiquing liberalism but from a different starting point than Marxism.
Okay, the communitarian view. The source positions this as a critique of liberalism, focusing less on economics and class and more on community and maybe human nature.
Exactly. The communitarian view operates from a fundamentally different set of assumptions about human nature and the relationship between the individual and society, compared to both liberalism's focus on individual autonomy and Marxism's focus on class conflict. The core belief here is that the essence of human nature isn't conflict or competition, but rather cooperation.
Cooperation. So humans are naturally inclined to work together.
That's the foundational belief. Mutual aid, shared life, collective endeavor. These are seen as the natural basis for human society and therefore for political organization. It resonates, as the source notes, with some very old ideas.
Like Aristotle again, that idea of the individual needing the state, the polis, to flourish.
Precisely. Aristotle's idea that the relationship between the individual and the state is like an organ to an organism, the state or community, is natural and indispensable for individuals to live a good life, and achieving that good life requires individual cooperation within the community. Modern communitarians built on this kind of thinking.
How do they articulate it in modern terms?
They argue that our individual identity, our talents, our goals, even our understanding of what constitutes a meaningful life, these things don't just spring from nowhere inside us. They develop and make sense only within the context of our place in a community.
A community defined by shared characteristics, maybe shared values, a common history, a sense of belonging.
Exactly. Things like shared language, culture, traditions, values, history, mutual understanding. And individual flourishing from this perspective isn't about maximizing your own isolated self-interest. It requires belonging to, participating in, and contributing to a well-functioning, healthy community.
And this is where it really clashes with the liberal view, right? Liberalism emphasizes the individual defining their own good.
Right. Liberalism tends to stress individual autonomy, the right and capacity of individuals to rationally choose and pursue their own conception of the good life, as long as they don't harm others. Communitarians challenge this. They argue that individuals don't just invent their good out of thin air. They typically discover their good as an integral part of understanding the good of the community they belong to.
So my good is tied up with our good.
In a very fundamental way, yes. And this discovery, this understanding, happens not primarily through competition or bargaining between self-interested individuals, but through cooperation, through participating in the shared life, practices, and traditions of the community.
So the individual's well-being, their identity, it's all seen as deeply interwoven with the community's health and its shared identity. And this is discovered by working together, living together.
That's the core insight. And this perspective leads directly to their view on politics. For communitarians, politics is instrumental to the pursuit of the common good. But their understanding of the common good is quite different from the liberal notion we discussed earlier.
How does it differ? The liberal common good was sort of the outcome of accommodating all the competing interests?
Right. Liberals tend to think that if individuals are free to pursue their own self-interest within a fair framework, the common interest will somehow emerge, maybe through market mechanisms or rational compromise. Communitarians fundamentally reject this idea.
They don't think pursuing self-interest adds up to the common good.
Not only do they think it doesn't necessarily lead to a genuine common good, but they go further. They question the liberal premise that individuals even have a primary moral right to pursue their self-interest separate from or potentially in opposition to the interest of the community.
Why? On what grounds do they argue that?
Because, from the communitarian perspective, the individual literally owes their existence and capabilities to the community. You wouldn't be the person you are with your language, your skills, your values, your opportunities without the social context, the community you were born into and nurtured by.
So since society made me, I have obligations back to it.
Exactly. The individual owes their existence, their personality, their potential to society. Therefore, communitarians argue, individuals don't have some inherent pre-social right to use these capabilities solely for their own perceived self-interest if it disregards or harms the common interests of the society that made them possible. A deep commitment to the community and its well-being is seen as essential to developing a full, virtuous personality.
That's a very different view of the individual, less autonomous, more embedded.
Much more embedded. And the source mentions some contemporary thinkers who really champion these arguments, often as direct critiques of modern liberal society.
Like who?
Alasdair MacIntyre is cited. He argues that virtues, qualities like courage, honesty, justice, the things we need to live a good life, aren't developed in isolation. They are developed through participating in cooperative human activities, what he calls practices, which have their own shared standards of excellence and are aimed at achieving goods internal to those practices, all within a community tradition.
And he sees liberalism as undermining this.
He suggested the strong liberal emphasis on individual autonomy, allowing socially disconnected individuals to just pursue their own self-appointed goals without reference to shared community standards or traditions, actually leads to social fragmentation, a decline in shared morality, and ultimately social disintegration. The source mentions he points to things like rising crime rates, family breakdown, widespread drug abuse in modern liberal states as potential symptoms of this moral disaster stemming from excessive individualism.
That's a pretty strong indictment.
It is. The source also mentions Charles Taylor, who criticizes what he calls the atomistic view of the self in liberalism, the idea of humans as isolated, self-sufficient atoms, insisting instead that humans are dialogical beings who must be situated within a cultural and linguistic framework to even make sense of themselves.
And Michael Sandel.
Sandel is noted for critiquing the liberal idea of the unencumbered or disjointed self, arguing instead that humans are always embedded in particular histories, communities, places, and cultures that shape their identity and values in ways they can't just shed at will. He insists on recognizing a deeper commonality that comes not just from shared interests, but from shared self-understandings and feelings of affection and solidarity within a community.
Okay, so if we pull the communitarian view of politics together, it's seen as the activity of collectively identifying and pursuing the common interest or the common good.
Yes, that's the central focus.
And this common good is believed to be something real, potentially unified, and naturally shared within a specific community.
That seems to be the underlying assumption, yes.
Right.
It's something to be discovered through shared deliberation and participation in the community's life.
And politics is the cooperative process of doing that, based on the idea that cooperation, not conflict, is the natural mode of human interaction within a well-functioning community.
That's the core idea. Politics is about finding and working together towards that inherent shared good, assuming cooperation is the foundation.
Wow. Okay. We've just walked through 3 incredibly different ways of looking at the same fundamental human activity, politics. Liberalism, seeing manageable conflict, politics as reconciliation, aiming for a common good that accommodates plural interests. Marxism, seeing fundamental, irreconcilable class conflict rooted in economics, with politics as a tool of domination that only ends with revolutionary transformation. And communitarianism, seeing cooperation as natural, downplaying conflict, with politics focused on discovering and pursuing a deeply shared common good within a particular community.
They really offer contrasting diagnoses and prognoses, don't they? And the source does a nice job in its conclusion of drawing out the chief differences, focusing specifically on how each view understands the nature and source of conflict, the prospects for its resolution, and ultimately the utility or purpose of politics itself.
That summary from Ralph Miliband, quoted in the source, really crystallizes the core difference between the liberal and Marxist views on conflict, doesn't it?
Yes, it's very concise and powerful. Miliband puts it something like this. The liberal view tends to see conflict as consisting of problems which are capable of being solved or managed through reason, goodwill, negotiation, compromise, implying the conflict isn't fundamentally intractable.
Whereas the Marxist approach,
The Marxist approach, Miliband says, views the core conflict as being rooted in domination and subjection inherent in the class structure. This implies the conflict is irreconcilable within the existing system and can only truly be ended by a total transformation of that system. It's not just a problem to be solved. It's a fundamental condition to be overcome.
problems to be solved versus domination to be ended, that's a stark contrast.
It really is. And the source also offers an interesting critique, or maybe a caution, regarding the liberal approach here. It points out a potential ambiguity in how liberal thought sometimes uses the terms compromise and cooperation.
What's the issue there? They sound similar.
They do, but the source suggests there's a crucial difference. True cooperation, it implies, ideally requires conditions of relative freedom and equality among the parties involved, people freely working together towards a shared goal. Compromise, however, can often be reached even when there are significant power imbalances.
Ah, so a compromise might just reflect the existing power dynamic. The weaker party accepts something less than ideal because they have no other choice.
Exactly. A compromise reached under conditions of dominance and dependence might not represent genuine cooperation or a truly reconciled interest. It might just be the best deal the weaker party could get, masking the underlying inequality. The source suggests that by sometimes using compromise and cooperation almost interchangeably, liberal writers might inadvertently obscure these crucial issues of power and dependence that could still exist beneath the surface of a political agreement.
That's a subtle but important point. It's not just that an agreement is reached, but how and under what conditions.
Precisely. And the source also revisits the role or function of conflict itself within these different views. For liberals, remember, conflict isn't necessarily just a negative thing to be gotten rid of. It can actually play a positive, functional, even civilizing role in society.
How so? Positive.
Yeah, the idea is that the clash of interests and ideas can be a source of dynamism, creativity, and progress. It can bring new issues to light, challenge old assumptions, and push society to find better solutions. It's like a necessary friction that helps generate new energy and move things forward.
Okay, so conflict can be productive in the liberal view.
Potentially, yes. For Marxism, however, conflict, specifically class conflict, is seen as fundamentally dysfunctional. It's not a source of healthy progress. It's a symptom of a deep, harmful pathology in society, that core rift caused by the class division, which perpetuates exploitation and alienation.
So any resolution achieved through politics under capitalism is just papering over the cracks.
Essentially, yes. Liberal attempts at resolution are seen as merely a poor consolation, a way to create the illusion of social harmony and justice in societies that remain fundamentally divided and unjust. Genuine harmony, from the Marxist perspective, is only possible after the root cause, the class system itself, is eliminated entirely.
And the source also includes a kind of reality check, or at least a commentary on the historical experience of trying to actually achieve that Marxist dream of a classless society.
It does. It notes quite soberly that the actual historical experience of the major 20th century socialist revolutions, like those in the Soviet Union and China, seems to demonstrate that the dream of creating a truly classless society, where all forms of dominance and dependence completely vanish, is extremely difficult, perhaps even impossible, to fully realize in practice.
Why? What gets in the way?
The source suggests that even in systems that explicitly aim to abolish economic classes, new forms of dominance and dependence often emerged, or persisted in subtle ways, maybe through the state bureaucracy, or between different national groups, or even on the international stage. It implies that achieving genuine social justice might require continuously scrutinizing and actively working to straighten out these ongoing, often complex dynamics of dominance and dependence wherever they appear, rather than simply relying on achieving a theoretically classless state or settling for what it calls vague compromises that might mask these realities.
That adds a layer of historical perspective and maybe caution to the Marxist vision.
It does. And then contrasting with both of those, you have the communitarian view, which, as we discussed, tends to downplay conflict significantly from the outset.
Right. It starts from the premise that there isn't really a fundamental structural conflict inherent in society. Instead, there's a natural underlying uniform common interest.
Yes, an interest that just needs to be discovered and articulated through shared deliberation and participation in community life. People are seen as naturally inclined to cooperate once they recognize this shared common interest. Conflict is seen more as a result of misunderstanding or a breakdown in community bonds rather than a fundamental feature of social life.
Okay, so we have these three very distinct perspectives: liberal, Marxist, communitarian, each offering a different story about conflict, cooperation, the state, and the common good. The big question then is, which one is right? Which theory should we, use to understand politics?
And this is where the source provides a really insightful conclusion. It's very careful not to declare any single one of these views as universally acceptable or definitively correct.
So it doesn't pick a winner.
No. Instead, it makes a much more nuanced and, I think, useful point. It talks about the suitability of each view, arguing that how well each theory describes reality might depend heavily on the actual nature of the specific society you're trying to understand.
Suitability based on the social context. How does that work? Can you unpack that?
Well, it suggests, for instance, that the liberal view, with its emphasis on pluralism, negotiation, compromise, and finding and accommodating common good, might be most suitable, most accurate, for understanding politics in societies that do not have extremely wide disparities of wealth, prestige, and power.
So, in societies that are relatively egalitarian, or at least where the gaps aren't enormous,
Exactly. In such societies where differences between groups are less extreme, the possibility of genuine compromise, rational deliberation, and the pursuit of a common interest that truly accommodates most people might actually be realistic. The liberal framework might be a good fit there.
okay, that makes sense. What about the Marxist view then? When is it most suitable?
The source suggests that the Marxist view, with its focus on fundamental class division, irreconcilable interest, domination, and the need for transformation, might be more applicable, more useful for understanding societies that are characterized by sharp, deep divisions between clearly dominant and dependent classes,
Especially in situations where maybe peaceful change seems blocked.
particularly in contexts where the dependent or oppressed classes feel they have no viable alternative for achieving significant change through the existing political system. In those situations, viewing politics through the Marxist lens of fundamental struggle and domination might provide the most accurate description of the underlying reality.
Okay, and the communitarian view, when does it fit best?
This view, the source suggests, with its emphasis on shared values, natural cooperation, and discovering a unified common good, would likely be most suitable for understanding societies where the members are already largely satisfied with their position and the overall state of the community, and where there's a genuine, widespread preparedness to cooperate for shared betterment. Perhaps smaller, more homogeneous communities or societies with a very strong shared culture and sense of identity.
But it wouldn't work so well in societies with big divisions.
That's the caution. The source argues that if a society is actually characterized by wide disparities of power, wealth, or status, and significant deep differences of opinion and interest among its members, then trying to apply the communitarian view might be futile or even naive. The necessary preconditions for its core assumptions, widespread satisfaction, shared values, natural inclination to cooperate towards a unified good, simply might not be present in that context.
That is a really powerful way to think about it. It's not about finding the one true theory of politics that applies everywhere, always. It's more about understanding that different theories might act like different kinds of lenses.
Exactly.
And which lens is most useful, most revealing, depends on the specific political reality you're looking at. It depends on the fundamental characteristics of that society. How divided is it?
Right.
How much inequality is there? How much shared identity or willingness to cooperate actually exists?
Precisely. It invites you, the observer, to first analyze the concrete social reality, and then consider which theoretical framework, liberal, Marxist, communitarian, or maybe even a combination or something else entirely best, helps you understand the dynamics of conflict, cooperation, power, and allocation that you actually observe happening there.
It makes the theories tools for analysis rather than rigid dogmas.
A much more flexible and potentially insightful approach. And the source's comparison table also neatly summarizes the core principle or value most strongly associated with each view, which is a helpful final takeaway.
Right, associating liberty primarily with the liberal view that focus on individual freedom to pursue self-appointed goals without unreasonable restraints.
That equality with the Marxist view specifically, equality understood as the absence of dominant and dependent classes based on the private ownership of the means of production.
And fraternity with the communitarian view, emphasizing that sentiment of shared belonging, shared culture, shared values, and common effort towards a social goal within a community. Liberty, equality, fraternity, echoing the French Revolution, but interpreted very differently here.
It provides a succinct way to remember this central normative concern animating each perspective.
This deep dive has really shown, I think, that politics is just so much more nuanced, so much more complex than the everyday headlines or those easy, cynical dismissals often suggest. It's clearly not just a dirty game. It seems to be a fundamental, maybe unavoidable aspect of how we humans organize ourselves in groups, how we manage scarce resources, and how we navigate the disagreements that inevitably arise when we live together.
Absolutely. We've traced its origins back to the ancient Greeks, seen it defined more analytically as this dynamic social process involving conflict and the need for authoritative allocation of values, and then explored these vastly different theoretical lenses for making sense of it all.
Yeah, the liberal focus on managing conflict through reconciliation, aiming for an accommodating common good in a pluralistic society. The Marxist focus on fundamental class conflict rooted in economics, seeing politics as domination that ultimately requires revolutionary transformation. And the communitarian focus on inherent cooperation within a community, with politics aimed at discovering and pursuing a deeply shared common good.
Thinking about these different perspectives really can change how you see things, can it?
Yeah.
Like, how does seeing politics as the authoritative allocation of values, that binding decision about who gets what, change how you think about, say, tax policy or healthcare access or environmental regulations in your own community or country?
Or how do these completely different views on the nature of conflict resonate with your own observations? When you see political disagreements playing out, do they look more like problems to be solved through compromise, liberal, or more like fundamental struggles over power and resources, Marxist, or perhaps sometimes like misunderstandings that could be overcome if people focused on their shared community, communitarian?
And maybe consider that final, really thought-provoking point from the source, that the suitability, the usefulness of each of these theoretical views might actually depend on the concrete reality of the society itself, on its levels of inequality, the depth of its divisions, the degree of shared identity and willingness to cooperate among its members.
So here's something to really chew on as you go about your day. Given that observation that the best lens might depend on the situation, which of these perspectives, or perhaps what blend of them, do you think best helps us understand the complex, often messy political situations we actually see unfolding in the world around us today?